So 20 years, 2 decades, a generation of believing that words can change the world. When this prize was founded in 2005, something fundamental shaped it in the fire of its creation, the forge of truth, that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. For us, it's the courage of an author to confront justice and injustice with a pen. What courage! Tonight, together, we are the peacemakers, not because we avoid conflict, but because we choose to engage with it productively. Every writer whose work we've honored across these 20 years has understood that wielding words can sometimes feel like taking up a weapon, and that often conflict occurs precisely because we don't take our words seriously enough. In an age of disposable, constant content, it becomes far easier to miss what really matters. Words matter. Human stories matter. As you think back on the writers we've honored, think about the writers around the world right now who risk their lives for the right to tell their stories, to speak freely. Think of the writers in this very nation, the journalists and reporters who are now threatened for seeking the truth and daring to write it. Think about calling real news fake and fake news real. We must recognize that honest stories told in defiance of censorship are acts of peacemaking. Every memoir that refuses to soften trauma, every novel that humanizes the enemy, every poem that gives voice to the silenced, these are not just art. They are the prayers that the voiceless will one day find their words among ours and tell their own stories of peace. The glory of peace, and I think this is something we sometimes forget, the glory of peace does not lie in winning. There is no trophy for defeating an enemy when your weapon is empathy. The glory lies in knowing you've done the right thing for someone else, that you've expanded the circle of human understanding even by a fraction, that you've made one reader somewhere see the world through the eyes of the other. So we together are the peacemakers, writers, readers, and champions for them both. Not because we're perfect, not because we have all of the answers, but because we believe in the power of stories to change hearts. Because we understand that every act of reading is an act of faith, faith that someone else's story matters, that their pain is real, that their joy is worth celebrating. So yes, welcome to our 20th anniversary celebration. Tonight we honor the enduring belief that words can mend what violence has shattered, that stories can rebuild what hatred has torn down, that literature, in all its beauty and bravery, remains our most powerful force for empathy, understanding, and peace. Thank you for believing in this mission, and thank you for being peacemakers in your own right. one book, one story, and one moment of understanding at a time. Thank you. A man that needs no introduction in Dayton, Ohio, Gilbert King.
That was really beautiful again. Thank you. It's great to be back here for the 20th anniversary. Isn't this place gorgeous? I just took a picture from the back and I looked at it. I was like, that is stunning. This place is just phenomenal, but nicely packed in tonight. Thank you. One of the great things about coming back to Dayton is sometimes you get to meet your literary heroes. This happened to me in 2015, 10 years ago, when Brian Stevenson was getting the award for his book, Just Mercy. And I was so excited that I was going to be meeting Brian and riding in the same car with him from the airport. But I was nervous, and I was trying to memorize how I would introduce myself to him and what I was going to say to him, because I was really nervous. And then I saw him in the airport, and he was approaching, and I finally walked up to him, shook out my hand, and said, Mr. Stevenson, my name is Gilbert King, and I had all these things planned to say. And he said, Gilbert, stop. I know who you are. I'm teaching your book in my law class at NYU. And I forgot everything I wanted to say to him at that moment. But now we're going to get on to some new literary heroes. Faraha Henry Jones is a Dayton area poet and English professor whose work celebrates the transformative power of language. She served as Sinclair College Poet Laureate from 2017 to 2021 and received the Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award for Poetry. Please welcome Faraha Henry Jones.
Look at how beautiful we are in this moment together. A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging by Lauren Markham is about Moria refugee camp on the island of Lesbos. Called Hell by some of its 11,000 residents, Moria caught fire in 2020 and burned like a massive pile of kindling. The book is also about 6 boys seeking asylum who were accused of starting that fire and who became scapegoats for Greece's callous management of that space and Europe's neglectful immigration policies. But it's also a writer's exploration, a writer who finds herself and loses herself and finds herself again on quests through the wilderness. Actual wilderness at times, as well as the wilderness of migrant stories, the wilderness of myth and history, the wilderness of limiting her own writing to journalistic parameters and thereby limiting other people's narrative sovereignty, the wilderness of her own family's very American migration story. This is a book about whiteness, about how a great-grandmother, Markham's ancestor, arrives at Ellis Island as Greek in a time when Greek and immigrant meant outcasts, criminals, offscourings of the earth, foreign scum, and how this Greek ancestor's progeny became white. It's about how European and American whiteness is maintained through distortions of history, romanticizing the past and cobbling a false ideal of the West from classical Greek history and culture. It's about how whiteness is wielded to create ironies like the transnationalism of ultra-right nationalism, and how whiteness undergirds systems that perpetuate our international immigration crisis. Lauren, my new friend, as the kids would say, your book is a lot. And also, as the kids would say, I'm here for it. Markham writes that life is a mosaic, not a line, And this is precisely how her book takes so much and weaves it into a powerful testimony. She moves us away from two-dimensional reductions of immigrants, and she invites us to see, really see people like Ali Sayed, one of the asylum seekers illogically accused of starting the Moria fire. She tells this story not in an easily palatable chronology like a true crime podcast, but in the recursive way that we live our lives. If, as Markham writes, a story is an oracle, this story prophesies the power of imagination to destroy us through false narratives, or alternately, the power of imagination to give us life through Sankofic critical analysis. A map of future ruins eschews time in its narrative and its philosophies, teaching us that stories of all kinds don't really have a clear beginning and may have a multiplicity of potential endings. Lauren Markham masterfully uses her skill of tenacious and well-crafted questioning, along with a poetic self-expression, to write a book that helps us fully understand how we can use literature and writing to find our way through the wilderness and across imagined borders of space, geography, and identity. Lauren, thank you for all the personal epiphanies you've ignited in my mind, and for those you ignite in all your future readers. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to present to you and the world the Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction runner-up, Lauren Markham.
I'm completely awestruck by, I hope you read the book, but I think that Faraha's introduction was perhaps better and stronger than the book itself, I have to say. It is such an honor to be among so many people who value and care about the written word and value and care about the written word as an agent of peace and bettering the society in which we live and the world in which we live. And it's a total honor to be here with just so many people I admire, and friends old and new. So, as Faraha said, in September of 2020, on the same day that where I live in Berkeley, California, the sky was so clogged with wildfire smoke that it turned a sickly orange-gray, and it sort of felt like the sun never rose. That same day, a fire broke out in the Moria refugee camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. The camp was widely lamented as a human rights graveyard. It had been built for just 2,500 people, but as Faraha also said, in 2020, when the fire broke out, there were 11,000 people living there in this makeshift shantytown slum on European soil among the fabled olive trees, and they'd wait years and years there as their asylum cases progressed or stalled through the immigration system. Fires were pretty common in Moria because of this shantytown nature of the place, but this time the entire camp burned down. It was positively gobbled by flame, and the people who were taking degraded refuge there set out on the run yet again, but they were marooned on the road. Fascist thugs blocked their passage to safety on one side, and the police blocked it on the other, as if to say, you belong nowhere else but in that camp, and nowhere else but within this seething conflagration. The entire camp was rendered rubble and ash, and within just a few days, the police arrested 6 teenagers from Afghanistan. It was them, they said, who had lit the fire. There was 0 credible evidence against these 6 young men, but they were sentenced to 10 years in prison all the same. 5 out of 6 of them were minors. I knew I wanted to write about this grave injustice, but the question was how. I'd first been to Moria about a year and a half before, in 2019. At the time, I was reporting on contemporary migration to Greece and researching my own family's migration story from the country roughly a century prior. I'd grown up with this very deep pride in being Greek, though I didn't know the language and I'd never been there, and I really had no connection to the place. But the slanted parallels I found in my imagined homeland, the parallels between contemporary migration in the US and that in Greece, between migrations of my family's past and those of the global present, both fascinated and astounded me. I've spent my life deeply preoccupied with the human impulse toward repressive barricade, the violent consequences of borders, and the rights of displaced people. I worked as a refugee resettlement caseworker, a school administrator for newcomer youth, and then, for a long time as a journalist. I wrote a book and countless articles, all portraying the effects of increasingly militarized borders. I saw the Moria fire case as the perfect symbol of today's violent border regimes, how hard governments have worked to mutate the profile of the asylum seeker into that of a dangerous invader, of a criminal. I'd come up with, I'd been raised with this deep pride in being Greek, and even though I didn't speak the language, and until 2019, as I said, I'd never been there. Like my family, though, many white people in the United States are animated by an ongoing claim to a faraway homeland that they've never been to, even as some tacitly or explicitly support the exclusion of contemporary migrants, people making a journey parallel to those their own ancestors made many generations ago. I've spent a lot of time hanging out in a high school courtyard, and one only has to do that for a few minutes to see evidence of just how motivated humans are by this really fundamental desire to belong, to be a part of a people, to be a part of someone. Belonging is a beautiful thing. The problem is that when one believes, or is made to believe, that belonging can only be achieved as someone else's exclusion, this can get tricky because insiders presuppose an outsider. A border has two sides. Today, politicians have mastered the art of convincing people that their belonging, their safety, their resources, their opportunities, their very identity is threatened by people on the other side of a line, and thus completely contingent upon violent exclusion. Another way of thinking about this is these politicians have really mastered the art of a pernicious storytelling. The thing that fascinates me most about borders is that they are complete inventions. They don't exist, and yet, they're these lines of grave consequence, and they matter. When writing A Map of Future Ruins, I became interested in how telling the long history of how borders are made and the long history of human migrations across time and geography might help us resist these divisive border stories. My first book was a studiously narrative one about two young immigrants from El Salvador. It meant a great deal to me and is sort of still tragically very relevant, but when it came to the Moria fire and all my research in Greece, I found that I couldn't write a book like that with the sort of beginning, middle, and end that moved in a straight line. A book in which I would efface myself as a presence and simply report the facts as I saw them. For a long time, I called this book my Weird Greece book, and it required me, I knew, to implicate myself and my own family story in the narrative. Ultimately, I came to understand with A Map of Future Ruins that I was writing a book about storytelling itself, its potential power, its potential frailty, its consequences. We tell stories in family systems, in communities, in politics, in history books, in journalism, in maps, in diplomatic pursuits, in bedtime stories we tell to our children, in works of great literature like those we're celebrating tonight. Every story we have to understand is some kind of manipulation. So we have to take good care with what stories we tell and how we are taking in the stories that we hear. How can stories teach us and animate us and illuminate our interiority and a desire to better know the world? How, conversely, can they degrade and destroy and yoke us, drag us into war or authoritarianism or the ceding of our basic human rights? Militarized borders, I've come to believe, are themselves narrative projects. As the brilliant scholar Wendy Brown puts it, when do the new walls we're building become like the confining walls of a prison rather than the comforting walls of a house? When does the fortress become a penitentiary? The purpose of literature, as I understand it, is to simultaneously hold a mirror and shine a light. Journalism in particular, but I think much fiction does this too. It has a mandate to constantly question and implicate systems of power and those who hold it. And ultimately, the writer, too, those of us wielding the pen, the one choosing the words and their order, occupies a great position of power as well. And it's a power we have to wield with great care and grace. And again, it's why I'm so honored to be here with so many writers who are doing just that. I'm honored to have this book recognized as a contribution to peace, and above all, to share this night with so many writers, thinkers, activists, and concerned humans who hunger, like I do, for more just and more expansive stories. Thank you so, so much.
It's amazing that beautiful book began with my weird Greece book. Kevin Riley is the former editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a position he was named to in January 2011. Kevin had a long career at Cox Enterprises, beginning in 1983 at the Dayton Daily News. Kevin is currently chair of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Board of Trustees. Please welcome back to the stage Kevin Riley.
Thank you, Gilbert. So few historians can wrap their arms around an enormous global story and then also guide you through it with vivid prose. Well, you're about to hear from just such a historian. In his book, The Burning Earth, Sunil Amrith entices you to join him on a compelling journey with his rousing command of language. And then you get to tag along on an astute voyage through the last 500 years of the world's environmental history. For the last 5 centuries, mankind at first dabbles with changes in Mother Nature's plan, and then eventually reroutes history. And by the way, Amrith may be, as he is, a highly respected and much decorated professor at Yale University, but he avoids anything close to those tedious lectures that many of us remember from our history classes. Instead, he insists on bringing us on a remarkable trip to understand that environmental history of the world. He begins at his own beginning, Singapore, where he grew up. But soon, we find ourselves on each of the continents and in more places than we have time to name, but including China, India, East Germany, Egypt, Brazil, and Mexico. In each place, he provides the necessary history to frame our concerns and hopes and to equip us for the debates today about how to return to respecting Mother Nature. After all, we've often mistreated her, and certainly we've routinely underestimated her. He recounts numerous times we followed our impulse to overlook how fragile our environment can be, and instead we insisted on our version of progress. Once we reflect on this point, we simply have to wonder, how can we possibly live in peace with each other if we can't live in peace with our environment? Amrith guides us to an important moment of reflection as he documents post-World War II attitudes, when all seemed possible, but our dilemma was exposed. He writes, "Man can be the master of his environment and not its slave," the United Nations predicted. That search for mastery brought drinking water to millions of people. It filled dinner plates with grain. It made whole regions of the world safer for human habitation. The costs of progress were never quite concealed, but over time, they became more visible. Engineered reservoirs submerged forests and uprooted communities. Intensive irrigation salinated soils. Land grabs deprived people of their homes. Oil wells exploded, poisoning people and birds and animals. So when you pick up this book, be ready to have your perspective challenged. Amrith refuses to restrict his story to the environmental problems that we Americans find ourselves most concerned with. And this ambitious world tour travels with great speed, so much so that I found one critic who seemed unhappy, as critics will be, that the book moves too quickly. But let's give credit where it's due. A skilled historian can travel faster with you on the page than even a modern jet can fly. Amrith has lots of ground to cover in a short time, and he makes it well worth keeping up with him. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of the 2025 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction, Sunil Amrith.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really kind, really generous. I'm profoundly grateful for this honor. and for the opportunity to share this evening with Lauren, with Priscilla, with Kaveh, magnificent writers whose words are a beacon in dark times. It's a privilege to be here tonight with Salman Rushdie. The Moor's Last Sigh was the first novel that really changed my life. It sparked my teenage imagination, allowed me to think about our fractured and interconnected world in a new way. And I'm sure it played no small part in the path that led me to become a student of Indian history. The Dayton Literary Peace Prize represents something that is precious, a celebration of the sense of connection that is the only true pathway to peace. In The Burning Earth, I argue that violence drives the planetary crisis in both a literal and a moral sense. The terrible conflicts of this decade in Gaza, in Syria, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, they speed up global warming with their gas-guzzling instruments of destruction. They devastate the habitats of migrating birds. They flood forests with water spilled from broken dams. Their toxic waste permeates the air, the soils, and the waters. To focus on their ecological harm does not undermine our primary and rightful focus on their terrible human toll. It compounds it by highlighting harm that will last for generations, long after the fighting is over. There's also a silent war, far from the headlines, unfolding around us, a war on environmental defenders. Global Witness publishes an annual list of environmental defenders arrested, harassed, murdered for the work that they do. 146 protectors of environmental and land rights were killed around the world for their work last year alone. We should know their names. Taking a long view, The Burning Earth shows that the most intensive periods of environmental destruction of the last 500 years coincide with the most intensive human injustices. War and violence have been major drivers of our environmental crisis. They continue to be so. And beyond their material effects, militarism lies at the heart of our planetary crisis for a less tangible but profound reason. It warps the moral and political imagination. It kills our ability to imagine interdependence with each other, let alone with the other species that share this planet. In 1917, Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali poet, playwright, and philosopher, observed the carnage of the First World War, not as a sudden convulsion, but rather as a slow culmination. The mechanized slaughter of war, Tagore saw, showed that an imperial world built on the domination of nature as well as people was now collapsing on itself. Suddenly, he wrote, "All the mechanisms going mad, it has begun the dance of the Furies, shattering its own limits, scattering them into the dust." The dance of the Furies. People all over the world now face the furies of an inflamed climate, of an Earth system that's behaving exactly in the way we'd expect it to, given the strains we've placed on it, with our extraction and our consumption and our endless desire for more. The poorest, the least insulated bear the brunt. Exactly the people who've contributed least, in many cases, nothing, to the causes of climate change. I'd like to read a few lines from Alice Oswald's Memorial, a book that rarely left my side when I was writing The Burning Earth. Lines that resonate so deeply for me as I think about how human violence unleashes a new violence in the earth itself. Like in autumn under the dripping wind, the earth's clothes grow heavy. She can hardly stand. God reigns on the roof, hammering his fists down. He's had enough of violent, smiling men. Now every one of us is being looked at under the rain's lens. Now the rivers are filling, they are overfilling. There are streams sawing through hills, cutting up the grass into islands. Everything is clattering into the sea. This is water's world, and the works of men are vanishing. Of those vanishing works of men and women, which shall we struggle to preserve, to protect, to remember? That is the question of our time. What will our lasting monuments be to true human flourishing? The burning earth is a call for us to imagine peace in more than human terms, to stop living as if we are at war with the earth. To do so will take radical empathy. It will demand humility. It will call for a new ethic of repair. All of these are qualities that are amply represented in the work of the other writers who share the stage today. I'd like to thank the amazing team at the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you, Nick Rains, the board, the many volunteers for all that you do for making this such a special occasion. My magnificent editor, Elaine Mason at Norton, shaped every step in the making of The Burning Earth. My students teach me more than I teach them, and their creativity, their courage are imprinted on every page of the book. And I pay tribute to the climate scientists whose funding is being stripped from them, the journalists, the podcasters, the librarians, the school teachers, the activists who work to ensure, to insist that we don't look away from how the climate crisis is affecting the most vulnerable people in the world right now. Thank you very much.
Going to move on to the fiction portion of the evening. Jung Yoon is the author of Oh Beautiful, a New York Times Editor's Choice and a San Francisco Chronicle Book of the Year, and Shelter, which was long listed for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize and a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award. She is an associate professor of English at the George Washington University. Please welcome Jung Yoon.
Thank you, Gilbert. Good evening, everyone. 3 years ago, the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, hosted an exhibition titled As They Saw It, Artists Witnessing War. One of the featured works that I spent the most time with was Francisco de Goya's Disasters of War, a series of 80 etchings that the artist secretly produced in the early 1800s during the French occupation of Spain and the Spanish War for Independence. The images in this series are unusual, both for the artist and the era. The prevailing aesthetic at the time, particularly for court painters like Goya, was to elevate acts of war, to memorialize battles as scenes of patriotism, valor, and honor. But the images in this series were decidedly different. Goya's depictions of the violence that he witnessed were graphic and unsparing, unlike anything he'd produced up to that point. Under each image, he wrote a brief caption as if to make sense of what he'd rendered, but the captions often point to a failure of language to adequately convey the horror of such violence. "This is bad," he wrote under one. "This is how it happened," was his caption for another. Under one particularly troubling image, he simply scrawled the words, "I saw this." Last summer, I thought often of Goya and the role of the artist as witness while reading Priscilla Morris's astonishing debut, Black Butterflies. The artist at the center of this novel is Zora Kocevic, a landscape painter who makes a fateful decision to stay behind in Sarajevo in the spring of 1992 while the rest of her family flees to England. One of the things that my fellow fiction juror Michael Parker and I admired most about this book was how it served to remind us of the haven that Sarajevo was before the city came under siege, fractured by nationalism, violence, and fear. Morris writes, "Zora's family on both sides has lived in Sarajevo for centuries. She was brought up scarcely aware of the ethnicity of her classmates, happy to celebrate 3 times as many religious festivals as usual, 4 including Jewish Passover. Sarajevo has always been held up as a model of tolerance. Zora cannot believe that this fighting will go on, that the real spirit of the city will not rise up and prevail." The fighting, however, does continue. Many of the city's landmarks fall, and its citizens are tested beyond measure while the skies fill with black butterflies, the ashes of burned books. As the weeks stretch into months, Zora and her neighbors become increasingly cut off from the rest of the world, left to fend for themselves. Yet the prevalence of violence and death, despite the prevalence of violence and death, Morris portrays the creative impulse, the urge to make and witness and share as a powerful affirmation of life. Like Goya's secret etchings, art once again becomes Zora's way of saying not only I saw this, but also I will survive this. When supplies run low, she paints with whatever she can find, soot, scraps, and salvaged paper, transforming destruction into creation. Here's Morris describing Zora's renewed sense of urgency. Having thought she would never paint again, Zora finds herself painting prolifically. Her fire series is executed rapidly. She's intoxicated by the brightness of the colors and the formlessness of the flames, which seem to unleash a new, impatient energy in her. She's always painted slowly, building layer upon layer using the impasto technique. Most paintings took weeks, sometimes even months to complete, but now she finishes her works in one sitting. Strange though it is, she has never been so productive. While Black Butterflies is a harrowing story about the siege of Sarajevo, it is also an intensely beautiful meditation on the saving grace of art and community, a subject that feels particularly fitting here in this room, here in the city of Dayton, here on the 30th anniversary to the month of the Dayton Peace Accords that brought an end to the war in Bosnia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce the runner-up for this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, Priscilla Morris.
Thank you so much. That was a very beautiful introduction. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here in Dayton, to be up here accepting this incredible award that celebrates books that promote peace, that stemmed from commemorating the Dayton Peace Accords for a book about Sarajevo, gives a wonderful sense of coming full circle. I can feel Zora, the artist protagonist of Black Butterflies, and my great-uncle, Dobrovoje Bjelkasic, the Sarajevan artist whose story inspired the writing of the novel, here with me, one on either side, receiving this prize and hoping I don't mess up this speech. I wrote Black Butterflies as a love letter and a work of mourning for the unique multicultural city of pre-war Sarajevo that I knew as a child. It shows how shockingly quickly a civilized society can descend into lawlessness, chaos, and killing, when ultra-nationalist leaders, concerned only with power, take control. It shows what it's like to live under siege, stripped of rights and basic amenities, surrounded by death and destruction, a situation that unfortunately we can see around the world today still, in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, to name but a few. I want to talk more about one of the major themes of Black Butterflies, art as resistance. I mentioned yesterday that in the second year of the Bosnian War, a remarkable, even miraculous thing happened. Exhausted, starving, depressed, abandoned Sarajevans started to engage in artistic activity. The creative life of the besieged city flourished. Plays, musicals, art exhibitions were held. Concerts played in the ruins of the burnt library. It was a show of defiance against the Serbs in the hills. You can bomb us and wear us down, but you cannot reduce us to the level of animals. Art was a way of reclaiming dignity and refusing humiliation, giving meaning and shape to the chaos and senselessness of life under siege, not succumbing to depression and suicide. During the siege of Sarajevo, art was shown to be an essential human need, not a luxury. Art also served to draw international attention to the plight of Sarajevans. American writer and critic Susan Sontag was invited to put on a play in besieged Sarajevo by Bosnian theatre director Haris Pasovic, and she immediately thought of Beckett's Waiting for Godot. She said, "It seemed written for and about Sarajevo, referring among other things to its central situation of endless, senseless waiting." The tramps Didi and Gogo, which were multiplied into 3 pairings with actors from all 3 ethno-national groups, provided an apt illustration of the feeling of Sarajevans, bereft, hungry, dejected, waiting for an arbitrary, alien power to save or take them under its protection. It ran for a week in July 1993 in a candlelit shelled theatre with the audience sitting on United Nations flour sacks. Lucky's broken nonsense speech about divine apathy and abandonment made complete sense in war-torn Sarajevo. The messenger boy who comes at the end, only 1 act was put on, was a strapping man wearing a blue UN helmet. When he uttered the words that Godot will not be coming today, but surely he'll come tomorrow, he was promptly attacked and beaten by 3 Didis and 3 Gogos. Waiting for Clinton was how Sontag sometimes referred to the play. While some Western journalists mocked her act as being equivalent of playing fiddle while Rome burned, many Sarajevans got it. Though most of them did, to be honest, prefer their own hugely popular staging of the anti-war musical Hair. They appreciated the expression of solidarity and the international attention Sontag's Godot garnered with its starkly critical message to the West. It made them feel seen, properly seen as human beings, not just as war victims at the end of a cameraman's lens as they fell to the ground crossing the street, shot by snipers. Sontag was made an honorary citizen of Sarajevo and a square named after her. This surely was an act of resistance that had some effect on the actors involved, on the audience, on people who read and heard about it around the world. And indeed, Godot has been put on in many other situations of oppression and abuse, in prisons, in South Africa under apartheid, in occupied Palestine. Each time, it's like a torch is shone on the particular situation. It's interesting that Goya was just mentioned, because I think of another Spanish painter. I think of the hand holding the candle that lights up the scene of carnage in the most famous work of anti-war art, Picasso's Guernica, made in 1937 about the devastating aerial bombing of the Basque town. The screaming mother with a dead baby, the dead horse, the severed arm of a soldier. This painting did change public opinion about the Spanish Civil War, which up till that point had largely favored Franco. It said, "This is happening here, and this is not acceptable." When I give talks about black butterflies, there is generally a divide in the audience. Those over 35-40 will have heard of the Bosnian War. Most will remember it being on their TV screens as much as Gaza is now, though they may have a hazy idea of what actually happened beyond lots of killing and endlessly broken ceasefires. I don't include you lot. I think you probably have a much better idea of the Bosnian War. Those under 35, those in their 20s often confess to not having known that a war that killed 100,000 people took place in Europe 30 years ago. I was stunned by this at first, and then glad that at least my book was saying, this happened there. Look how easily it happened. Civilians being killed, wherever it happens, is clearly an outrage. And it starts with division, fear, the erosion of rights, the censoring of speech, the curtailing of freedom. The descent into a state of siege can be terrifyingly rapid. Art can be the hand holding the candle. It can make the suffering of marginalized, violated people visible. It says, this is happening here. Pay attention, resist. Thank you so much to all those. Thank you so much to all those involved in the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, to opening your hearts to Zora, Mirsad, Lenka, Samir, and Una, who I carried around with me for 13 years, and to your very great welcome and hospitality here this marvelous weekend. Thank you.
So apparent how much heart these writers are putting into their storytelling. It's beautiful. Andrew Krivak is the author of 5 novels, 2 books of poetry, and 2 works of nonfiction. His 2011 debut novel, The Sojourn, was a National Book Award finalist and winner of both the 2012 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Fiction and the inaugural Chautauqua Prize. He is also the author of The Bear, which received the Massachusetts Book Award and was a 5-time National Endowment for the Arts Big Read title. His novel, Mule Boy, is forthcoming this February. Andrew is currently a visiting lecturer of English at Harvard. Please welcome Andrew Krivak.
I'd just like to say first that it's always a pleasure, and I love coming back to Dayton, and so I'm grateful for your invitation here. What is language capable of? It's not a rhetorical question, because I know if you give it some thought, each of you in this room has an answer. I know each of you has the language from a novel, a work of nonfiction, or perhaps a poem even, in your mind that you reached for when I asked that question and you thought, that's what language is capable of. I knew an editor once used to say to me, everyone has a subject. The question is, what's the story? If that's true, then maybe the real question is, what is story capable of? Once again, not rhetorical, because I'm willing to wager a sizable bet that it was a story you reached for when I asked the question, what is language capable of? Because it's story that comes out of the blast furnace of experience and imagination. The ore of language turned into something that, in the right hands, affects change and endures. Writers here tonight, think of how many times someone has asked you, what do I need to do to become a writer? When I get that question, I always say, read as much as you possibly can, and then read some more. Never stop reading, because you never want to be without a story that you love knocking around in your head. Or, to extend the metaphor, firing the ore to become the shape of a thing that will delight as well as denounce, declare as well as plumb the depths of language, and always deliver something more powerful than we believe we are capable of. I love Kaveh Akbar's novel Martyr for this reason and more. I love its story of journey, that wandering of the living and the dead, that pain of the search for meaning and living against the meaninglessness of loss. I love its story of love and what is sacrificed for love, down where the spirit meets the bone of Cyrus Sham. And I love its story of witness, that root out of which the word martyr is born. Witness of the day-to-day, witness of the quotidian. This novel takes up and struggles with all of these paths of a story. In a language capable of rebirth in the face of death, Martyr becomes a story capable of reaching for creation when the only inheritance we are given is an inheritance of loss. And yet, in the midst of loss, this novel asks the question, what if our inheritance in the end is not only mourning the loss of others, but coming to know unexpectedly the peace and stillness of purpose, a purpose that is simply prayer, the root of which is simply to question, to ask, please. What if? What if that question is also not a rhetorical one? In a poem entitled Prayer, Kaveh Akbar writes, "It is not God, but the flower behind God I treasure." And in the novel Martyr, there is in the end a similar answer to a similar prayer. Not prayer itself, but the stillness it leaves. That, my friends, is what story is capable of. The flower we treasure, the stillness of prayer, the peace of which, let's face it, sometimes we question. But we find here, in this story, the possibility that the struggle of the story is always the power and the purpose of peace. That is the flower behind the novel Martyr, a flower we all treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you the 2025 winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Fiction, Kaveh Akbar.
Oh, I can see you so much better today. That was extraordinary, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank my editor, Jordan Pavlin, Il Miglior Fabbro, for believing in me in this book from the second it landed in your inbox. Thank you to my steadfast agent, Jacqueline Coe, especially for your years of joyfully and passionately representing me when I was but a lowly poet. To the other writers recognized tonight, to the judges, the organizers, it has been a dream. Your company is the prize. Tommy, Angel, and Shira, Dan, Karen, group chat, thank you. The book and I are better made for having been loved by you. To my spouse, Paige Lewis, the past decade sprinting to keep up with your mind has made my own indelibly quicker, wiser, and more humane. Thank you, I love you. 13 years ago, I was still in active addiction, pissing the bed nightly, lurching from crisis to crisis, passing out every night, hoping not to wake up. It is absurd to be standing here tonight. Literally absurd. It strains credulity. It is absurd to be here, too, in this extraordinarily beautiful, warm space, as a third winter falls across a besieged Gaza. Such is the ineffable at-onceness of these moments. It is absurd that people who look and pray like me and my cousins and uncles, with hearts that could fit in my chest, will die today from bombs forged and dropped by my tax dollars. Absurd that weeks after announcing a purported ceasefire, just today, as of my writing this at 2:56 p.m. Eastern, November 9th, 2025, Israel has bombed the Barej refugee camp, killing 3 people, and has carried out a sequence of drone strikes in Lebanon with casualties yet unreported. Israel is, as of today, November 9th, 2025, still only allowing a third of the agreed upon humanitarian aid into Gaza? From the vantage point of a Palestinian parent's mortal terror, my moral outrage, my insulted sense of human dignity looks profoundly comfortable. It is incumbent upon me, and yes, I do think us, to leverage that delta between our outrage and their terror into action. I spoke about this a bit yesterday in the panel, but it is central to my belief in fiction's role towards revolutionary action. Empire uses the abstraction of data, a fire hose of meaningless language, to cudgel us into idleness and cynicism. Literature opposes this, asks us to slow down our metabolization of language, become aware of its bond and density. My novel Martyr attempts to show how a single life erased from time, one of 290 civilians killed by the US Navy on July 3, 1988, on board Iran Flight 655, ripples through the lives of its characters for decades. Every conversation Cyrus has, every person he sleeps with, every drug he does and doesn't do stems from a single woman being shot out of the sky in 1988. I have two nieces. The older, Nora, does math worksheets for fun. She already reads faster than me and possibly with greater comprehension. The younger, Layla, writes and mails lengthy letters to my dog. Not to me or to my spouse, but to my 45-pound blue heeler, Galilee. She fixes stamps on the envelopes, drops them in a blue postbox by her school. The way I love my nieces, the way I recognize them as utterly unprecedented and irreplaceable, is how every Palestinian feels about the kids in their lives. It is excruciating to have to say right now, this second, people who look and pray like me love our children the exact same way you love yours. There is no such thing as a bad child. There is no serious ethical or political system that can justify the murder and starvation of children. The official civilian death toll in Gaza now tops 69,000. When I say 69,000 civilians killed in Gaza, I'm aware I have uttered a pulverizing reality, but it lacks definition. My brainstem just recognizes a large number, bigger than 5, fewer than 1 million. I cannot distinguish somatically between 69,000 and 68 or 70. This is not, I don't think, a moral failure, but it is a moral crisis. I believe writers, in concert with organizers and teachers and plumbers and grant writers and legal advocates and everyone else, have this role to play in peace work. By restoring specific narrative to abstract historical data, we restore for readers the urgent, somatic obliteration of individual loss. Tony Cade Bambara says the job of the artist is to make revolution irresistible. If you recognize the interiority of the harmed as being as vivid and complex as your own, it becomes impossible to sit idly by amidst a live-streamed genocide. It is not complicated to say, I am on the side of whoever is not actively starving children, unless the contingency of those children's humanity is an unanswered question in your mind. I'm grateful for language today. The future I want to live in has books and writers celebrating those books. But far more urgently, the future I want to live in is one where hospitals aren't rubbled in the night, where refugee camps aren't bombed weeks into a purported ceasefire, where orphan children do not have to record videos of themselves weeping over their murdered parents to persuade the world of their humanity. The Iraqi poet Dunya Mikhail says, writing is not medicine, it's an X-ray. That is to say, the work we do as writers points to action, but does not supplant it. I'm a professor who makes more money than I need to feed and house myself. I will be donating the entirety of this prize money to Doctors Without Borders, and I invite everyone present with the means to contribute any amount as well. It takes 30 seconds. You can do it on your phones right now at doctorswithoutborders.org. Thank you again to the judges and to everyone who read Martyr. The gift of your time and attention is towering. I will work the rest of my life to make myself worthy of your regard.
Thank you, Kaveh. Kati Martin is the New York Times best-selling author of 10 books, including True Believer, Stalin's Last American Spy, and Enemies of the People, and My Family's Journey to America, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Chancellor, her biography of Angela Merkel. An award-winning former NPR correspondent and ABC News bureau chief in Germany, she was born in Hungary and lives in New York City. Please welcome Kati Martin, followed by Josh Carter, who will introduce our Richard H. Holbrook winner. Kati.
Kaveh, your words overwhelmed me, as they did all of us. Thank you for saying them. They were painful to hear, but absolutely urgent and necessary. I am so grateful to be back with all my friends in Dayton, and once again to be inspired by my most admired fellow scribes. I always leave here motivated to double my output. Doesn't usually work, but I do leave with a great deal of motivation and enriched by wonderful new friendships, which sustain me in the lonely, in the solitary occupation that I have chosen as my own, which is writing. We celebrate the best American writers tonight, but the reason that we celebrate here in Dayton is because of what happened here 30 years ago. American leadership ended the most savage European war since Hitler's here in this town. I was, yay, Dayton. I was privileged to be inside the high wire fence of Wright-Patterson Air Base for many of the 21 days that my late husband, Ambassador Richard Holbrook, the chief negotiator, cajoled, browbeat, and ultimately compelled the Balkan warlords to end the deadliest modern European war. American diplomacy forced the Serb aggressors to lift their 42-month-long siege of Sarajevo. The bombed city has been rebuilt. We knew, the world knew that America was good at weapons and making wars, but here in Dayton, we demonstrated that we were also pretty good at making peace. And I was so proud. As a recently naturalized American, I was a refugee from the Soviet reoccupation of my homeland. I was immensely proud to have played a minor role in that effort. They were called proximity talks, and the warring parties' proximity to each other inside that airbase was crucial to its success. Weeks of intense daily interaction beyond the conference rooms, beyond the formal agendas, away from the media's glare, in the confines of the modest barracks that we all shared, over meals on the base and at Packy's Sports Bar, which was the delegates' preferred after-hours retreat, and where I observed Slobodan Milosevic nightly flirt with waitress Vicky, who I don't think had any idea that the man flirting with her at the bar was one of the great war criminals of her time. But human interaction was impossible to avoid in the confines of the base, and that was Richard's brilliant plan, to bring these warring warlords who had only one purpose until then, which is to deal knockout punches to each other. Just weeks before, they were trying to gouge each other's eyes out, and now they were forced to live together for 3 weeks. I was there not as a journalist or as a writer, but as the recently wed wife of the chief negotiator who wanted me by his side. Richard was a determined, creative diplomat who used any instrument to hand, and I was often used as an instrument of his diplomacy, and I was delighted to be used. Make them talk to each other. That was my first assignment from my new husband. The them were Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb autocrat who lit the torch of racist nationalism, which exploded into vicious civil war, and Alija Izetbegovic, the taciturn president of the Bosnian Muslims, his bitter foe. And in the wake of the horrifying discovery of the Serbs' massacre of 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica, Izetbegovic was justified for his stony silence in Milosevic's presence. There was, however, no way that I was going to fail at my first diplomatic assignment from my new husband. I was going to make them talk to each other. At Dayton's formal opening dinner, which was held in a vast hangar, Richard seated us beneath a gigantic B-2 bomber, a reminder that if diplomacy failed, America had other weapons. My dinner partners, Milosevic and Izetbegovic, fixed their gazes into the far distance and pretended the other didn't exist. Milosevic beat time with his spoon to the songs of the Glenn Miller-style Air Force Band. By the second course, I was out of small talk. I was sweating. With nothing to lose, I plunged. So, how did this war start anyway? I said, pretending to be stupid. Suddenly, the two war criminals engaged and started arguing, forgetting themselves and each other momentarily, and before long, they were calling each other Slobo and Alija. Remarkably, the two who had unleashed this bloody war expressed shock at the length and the brutality of it. Still, the two enemies were speaking to each other. I flashed a triumphant smile across the hangar at Richard, who put a hand to his heart. On November 20th, nearly 3 weeks into the peace talks, the negotiations broke down. It was a squabble over literally kilometers of territory, but territory that was occupied by the Serbs and claimed by the Muslims, a town called Brichko. Everybody was exhausted. There were about 20 people in the suite that Richard and I shared, and it looked like a college dorm after a binge weekend with people splayed on couches, and I've never seen Richard, who was preparing his closing statement, a statement of failure. I'd never seen him so deflated. Suddenly, looking out the window, it had started snowing, and I looked out the window, and I recognized the dark bulk of Milosevic walking up and down on the icy quadrangle. And without reflection, I grabbed my coat and ran out and literally pulled him into the room. It was so obvious to me that he had something to say. So the shivering Milosevic, still with his coat on, mumbled, okay, I will walk an extra mile for peace, and agreed to defer any decisions on Britchko for some future time. Wasting absolutely no time for second thoughts, Richard and the visiting Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, literally sprang up and sprinted across the courtyard to Izbegovic's suite. And I think they woke Izbegovic up. But anyway, it was for sure a very startled Izbegovic faced by these two Americans who said, "Will you accept the offer?" He gasped, and as usual, indecisive as he was, sighed deeply, and very slowly, very reluctantly, he answered, "It is an unjust peace, but my people need peace." Grabbing Warren Christopher's arm, Richard whispered, "Let's get the hell out of here." And the two ran like thieves in the night. And Richard tore up his statement of failure and composed another one, "Peace in Sarajevo, peace in Bosnia." And that was Dayton, and the town of Dayton played an enormous role, and I want to thank you for that. All those candles and windows that all of you citizens of Dayton lit, and the quiet processions along the base, all of that kept our spirits up inside, and you are forever lodged in my heart as the city of peace, and as long as you will have me, I will keep coming back. So. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I'd like Josh to come and introduce Salman, who I have to say is the perfect recipient of the Richard Holbrooke Prize. Thank you.
Good evening. You know, Kati reminds us that peace is hard, and that we don't have to make peace between peaceful people. We make peace where it's needed. So thank you for your work, and thank you to Dayton. So when I learned that I was introducing Salman Rushdie as this year's Ambassador Richard C. Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award winner, I thought about how many oddly specific things he had in common with last year's honoree, my grandfather, Jimmy Carter, that goes well beyond a lifetime of reading and writing. They are both exceedingly fast at autographing books. They are both distinguished professors at Emory University. They both seem to really enjoy being on The Daily Show. They both know what it's like to have a book they wrote receive widespread condemnation from world leaders who never read word past the title. And I could imagine that Carter's and Rushdie would be able to find some common ground if we ever got into a conversation about the Ayatollah. But I wasn't going to get a better excuse to put Midnight's Children on top of my reading list. So for a moment, I became the newest in a line of people 40 years long to be introduced to Salim Sinai. Salim is a kid from Bombay, India. And just by the virtue of his birth, Salim is intimately invested in the success or failure of the government that he lived in. When he was born, his country had endless promise. His country's pride was his pride. His country's pain was his pain. He intimately felt his country's advances being halted His promise is broken, and its peace shattered. And I felt like I could connect with Selim. But unlike me, Selim was magical. He had an enormous nose that could smell individual ingredients in people, and he could smell hopes and dreams and desires as easily as he could smell mint and ginger in a street food. He could read minds, and he could discover the innermost thoughts of anybody in his country at any time. And he could even telepathically communicate with other children. And he used one of these connections to jump into a snake charmer's basket and disappear. It was pure magic. But really, how magical is it to find an old connection to escape oppression? How big of a nose do you really need to smell corruption? What does it mean to live as someone who can literally read the minds and capture the innermost hopes and desires of an entire population and still not be able to escape encroaching authoritarianism? What other truths are hiding in this fiction? And to that end, Midnight's Children is not the only fiction telling truths. We can lose our innocence with Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye. We can find humanity in a runaway slave named Jim as he rafts down the Mississippi with his friend Huck Finn. And we can experience the pain that one act of racism brings to an entire community by following Tom Robinson and Atticus Finch. These are powerful stories because they bring you to a time and a place that is inaccessible, and they show you a human experience that would otherwise be impossible. These are stories that replace fear of the other with understanding. Now, in some places in America today, these stories are being banned. Our nation has never had such a powerful assault on our First Amendment rights. And these are not idle threats. For the first time in American history, we have a president who strips funding from artists who explore human experiences they don't want to hear about, and who takes control over cultural centers to prevent art that they don't like. We have a president who calls the press the enemy of the people, and who sues newsrooms for doing their job. And just last week, the President of the United States declared that it should be illegal to have a TV show that was against him. With any other president in our nation's history, the events of the past 10 months would be impossible. So make no mistake, this is a critical point in our nation's history. And at this critical point, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize recognizes a professor who teaches us that the health of a free society is directly related to its ability to absorb ideas and perspectives, especially ideas that might be disagreeable or offensive. Tonight, we elevate an author who has given us a lifetime of new perspectives, showing us that people all over the world and across time share a common humanity. And we honor a champion who at every turn carries our unchanging principle of free speech and free expression through a fatwa, through an attempted murder, and through today. So it is my distinct honor to welcome this champion, Salman Rushdie.
Man, I don't know, I'm so moved by what I've heard here tonight from all these wonderful writers and their nominators. I'm really deeply moved by what I've heard. Kaveh, I think what you said was extraordinary, and I would like to join you in saying that whatever money shows up tonight, I will also donate. All right. I don't want to, you've all heard a lot of speeches. I don't want to talk too long. I want to say two things about Dayton. One is that it's extraordinary to be in the place where the Bosnian War was ended. Kadi, thank you for your remarks. We've known each other a long time. It's wonderful to be in the place where you were a part of that great negotiation with war criminals to make peace. Maybe the hardest thing to do. The other thing that I knew about Dayton was a song by Randy Newman. Would you like to come over for tea with the missus and me? I've had a very nice time coming over for tea here for the next couple of days, so thank you for that. I'm so touched to be introduced by Josh, by Jimmy Carter's grandson. And I have two things to say about Jimmy Carter. One is that I met him a few times and he was really nice to me. And the other is that there was a day when I was doing a literary event at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and I had to sign a lot of books. And the folks at the Carter Center boasted to me about how fast President Carter was at book signing. And I said, well, what's his record? And they said it was about 900 books in an hour. So I signed 1,000. And I'm very proud to have beaten him in his own house. Sorry. Here we are in a time of war to talk about peace. There's two wars that we all know about, the war in Ukraine and the struggle in Gaza, or the massacre in Gaza. There's also a war which gets a lot less attention, which is the genocide in Sudan. We live in a time of massacre. Unbelievable, inexcusable violence. And to talk about peace at such a time, I don't know, seems like a fairy tale. There was a moment a couple of years ago when PEN America had an event at the United Nations to ask the question about what could writers do in such a time. And I remember saying that we can't overclaim for literature. A book cannot stop a bullet. A poem cannot intercept a bomb. So what can we do? And I think what we can do, first of all, is to tell the truth. And to say, here is what is really happening, not what people tell you is happening, here's what is really happening. And we can express our solidarity with the people on the front lines, our colleagues, our writers, our journalists on the front lines who are fighting the fight. And we can enlarge their voices by adding our voices to their voices. That is some of what writers can do. The question that an event like this asks, which is, what can literature contribute to peace, is more complicated, I think. I would say that it can do two or three things. One is that it can show us the reality of the other. It can show us what life looks like, not from our point of view, but from another point of view. And you know, a lot of the books that I read and love are not written in the language that I speak. They were originally written in Russian or Japanese or German or French. And through the miracle of translation, they're available to us. And what they give us, what literature gives us, is the world. What literature gives us is what other people think and how other people see the world, and it helps us to understand that. And that's an important contribution. Also, I think we live in a time where we're asked to define ourselves more and more narrowly, single dimension. We're liberals, or we belong to the people who wear red hats, or we're Jews, or we're Muslims, or whatever it might be. Single category definitions. But one of the things that the art of the novel has always known is that that's not what human beings are like. Human beings are plural, multiple, contradictory, many things at once. The people that we are with our children is not the people that we are with our employers. The people who we are with our friends is not the people who we are with people we don't like. We are all a bundle of characters, not single characters. We're multiple characters, and we're confusing. And as Walt Whitman says, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. That's what the novel has always known, that human beings are that, multiple. When you try to define yourself narrowly in a single category, it's very easy to find reasons to disagree with other people and to contest other people's reality. When you see yourself as plural, it's easier to find common ground with other people. You can vote for different parties but support the same baseball team. When you see yourselves as 25 people at the same time, maybe 2 of those 25 coincide with the attitudes of your adversary. So the literature tells us that we are plural. We are not singular, we are plural. And through our plurality, we can learn how to touch each other and how to meet each other and how to speak to each other. This is the art of the novel. One of the strange things about literature as it has developed down the ages is that if you look at the great classical myths, if you look at the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, these are texts which glorify war. War is wonderful. Warriors are heroes. But we've changed our attitude about that. The literature of the modern age does not glorify war. It tells us other stories about war. If you read Catch-22 or Slaughterhouse-5, or Kazuo Ishiguro's wonderful book about Nagasaki, Pale View of Hills, you see that war is not that great, and that the side we should be on is not the side of the glorification of war, but the side of prevention of war. And so the literature becomes a weapon of peace in that way. We live in a time, I don't want to, everybody's here wants to go home, so I'm going to cut it short. The last thing I want to say is that we live in a moment of censorship. PEN America recently released a report which said that at this moment in the United States, there are 23,000 active book bans. In some cases where a single parent has objected to the presence of a book in a school library, and as a result, it has been removed from the library. And these are not any old books we're talking about. This is Toni Morrison's Beloved. This is Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. This is The Catcher in the Rye. This is To Kill a Mockingbird. These are some of the most important books that there are in our time. I just want to say that what books do is they open the world, and what censorship does is it closes the world. And a closed mind is a mind which finds more reason for conflict, and an open mind is a mind which finds more reason for peace. There's a wonderful moment in Saul Bellow's novel, The Dean's December, in which the main character, a dean from the University of Chicago who's married to a Romanian scientist, they go back to Romania for reasons of her family. And this is Romania in the time of Ceausescu, etc. And it's winter, and it's really cold. And he's standing at the window of his wife's family's apartment looking out at a park, and it's freezing cold, and the trees are bare, and etc. And he hears in the distance the barking of a dog. The dog goes on and on and on and on, barking and will not stop. And because this is a novel by Saul Bellow, he needs to understand what the dog is trying to say. And the dean decides that what the dog is saying in its agonized barking is the dog is making a protest about the limitations of dog existence. And what he is saying is, for God's sake, open the universe a little more. I've always thought that's the most beautiful sentence. And it's a sentence which tells us about the meaning of art. That's what art is. For God's sake, open the universe a little more. Let us understand a little more. Let us see a little more clearly. And let us, if we're lucky, find the road to peace. Thank you.